This book was generated using Speakter's AI voices. You can create human-like voiceovers in over 50 languages.
Charles Bovary's journey through medical school was a constant struggle. His mediocre performance left him frustrated and doubting his abilities at every turn. The lecture halls echoed with the confident voices of his peers, while Charles fumbled through his notes, his hands clammy with anxiety. Each exam felt like a battle, and more often than not, he emerged defeated. After years of barely scraping by, Charles finally graduated and became a health officer in the rural town of Tostes. The cobblestone streets welcomed him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. As he walked through the town square, the air thick with the scent of freshly baked bread and manure, Charles felt the weight of countless eyes upon him. The townsfolk, their faces weathered like old leather, eyed the newcomer warily. Charles plastered on a smile that never quite reached his eyes, his stomach churning with a mixture of hope and dread. His mother, a formidable woman with eyes like flint and a tongue sharp enough to cut glass, wasted no time in arranging his future. Like a puppet master pulling strings, she orchestrated his marriage to Eloise Dubuque, a wealthy widow whose years far outweighed Charles's own. The air in the room crackled with tension as his mother laid out her plans, her words leaving no room for argument. Their wedding day dawned gray and cold, a perfect mirror of the union itself. The church bells rang out, their somber tones a far cry from joyous peals. Eloise, draped in an ill-fitting white gown, resembled a ghost more than a bride. Her pale skin seemed to blend into the fabric, giving her an otherworldly appearance. Charles stood beside her, his shoulders slumped under the weight of expectation, feeling more like a prisoner than a groom. As the days turned to weeks and weeks to months, the Bovary household became a battlefield of silent resentment. The air inside their home grew thick and oppressive, filled with unspoken accusations and bitter disappointment. Heloise ruled their finances with an iron fist, each coin accounted for, each expense scrutinized. The constant scratching of her quill in the ledger became a torturous soundtrack to Charles's days. He felt the noose of her control tightening around his neck, stealing his breath and his dreams. In his medical practice, Charles fumbled and faltered. His hands, once steady in school, now trembled as he examined patients. The cool metal of his stethoscope felt foreign against his sweaty palms. The townspeople's initial wariness turned to outright distrust. Whispers followed him down the street, carried on the wind like autumn leaves. "Did you hear about Madame Lafour's leg? He nearly amputated the wrong one." The words stung like a slap to the face. My Johnny's fever only got worse after the good doctor's visit. Each criticism was another nail in the coffin of his reputation. Charles's dreams of becoming a respected physician crumbled like sandcastles against the tide of his own incompetence. Each failed diagnosis, each botched treatment, chipped away at his already fragile confidence. The weight of his failures pressed down on him, making even the simplest tasks feel like monumental efforts. At home, Heloise's nagging voice became the soundtrack to his misery. Her words, sharp as knives, cut deep into his psyche. "You call yourself a doctor? Ha! You can barely tie your own shoelaces without my help." The constant barrage of criticism left Charles feeling small and insignificant, like a child being scolded. The walls of their home seemed to close in, suffocating Charles with the stench of his own failure. He began to dread returning home, finding solace in long walks through the countryside. The open fields and rustling trees offered a brief respite from the prison of his marriage. The cool breeze on his face felt like a gentle caress, a stark contrast to the cold shoulder he received at home. Heloise, her insecurities festering like an open wound, began to see threats in every shadow. Her eyes, once dull with indifference, now burned with unfounded jealousy. "Where were you last night? With that baker's wife, I suppose. Don't think I haven't seen the way she looks at you." Her accusations flew like daggers, each one finding its mark in Charles's bewildered heart. Charles, faithful to a fault, could only stare in bewilderment at his wife's accusations. The irony of her suspicions, given his utter lack of charm or appeal to other women, would have been laughable if it weren't so tragic. He felt trapped in a maze of her making, with no way out in sight. Years passed like this, a monotonous parade of disappointment and regret. Charles aged before his time, lines etching themselves deep into his face, his eyes losing their spark. Heloise, too, seemed to wither, her bitterness eating away at her like a cancer. Their home, once filled with the promise of a new beginning, now felt like a mausoleum to their dying dreams. Then on a day like any other, fate intervened. Heloise, complaining of a headache, took to her bed. At first, Charles dismissed it as another of her dramatic episodes, but as the hours ticked by, her condition worsened. The air in the sick room grew heavy with the scent of illness and fear. Charles, for once in his life, felt the stirring of true medical urgency. He tended to her with a care and attention he had never shown before. His hands, usually so clumsy, moved with newfound purpose as he checked her pulse and temperature. But it was too late. Heloise's illness, swift and merciless, claimed her life in a matter of days. As Charles stood by her deathbed, watching the last breath leave her body, he felt a confusing mixture of grief and relief wash over him. The shackles of his unhappy marriage had been broken, but at what cost? The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the clock, marking the passage of time in a world suddenly turned upside down. In the quiet of their now empty home, Charles Bovary found himself a widower, facing an uncertain future, with a strange sense of liberation tinged with guilt. As night fell, casting long shadows across the room, a knock at the door shattered the stillness. Charles's heart raced as he approached the entrance, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. Who could it be at this hour, and what news could they bring that would change the course of his life once again? The news of Heloise's death struck Charles like a thunderbolt. It arrived with a solemn finality, leaving him stunned and adrift in a sea of conflicting emotions. As he grappled with this unexpected loss, fate intervened, pulling him from his grief into the bustling world of his medical practice. A summons arrived, urgent and insistent, calling Charles to the aid of Monsieur Rouault, a prosperous farmer who had suffered a broken leg. The winding country road stretched before him like a ribbon of possibility, each turn bringing him closer to an encounter that would change the course of his life. The Rouault farm materialized on the horizon, a patchwork of fields and weathered buildings. As Charles approached, the air grew thick with the earthy scent of hay and livestock, a stark contrast to the sterile environment of his small-town practice. The farmyard bustled with activity, a symphony of animal sounds and human voices creating a lively backdrop. Amidst this rustic chaos, a figure caught Charles's eye, moving with a grace that seemed out of place in the rough-hewn surroundings. It was Emma, Monsieur Rouault's daughter, a vision of youth and beauty that took Charles's breath away. Her chestnut hair gleamed in the sunlight, each movement a dance that captivated his senses. As Charles tended to the farmer's injury, his gaze kept wandering to Emma. Her delicate features and refined manners stood out against the backdrop of the farm like a rare orchid blooming unexpectedly in a field of wildflowers. With each glimpse, Charles felt his heart quicken, a sensation both thrilling and unsettling. Days turned into weeks as Charles made his regular visits to check on Monsieur Rouault's recovery. During these visits, he and Emma began to steal moments together, their conversations a delicate dance of words and emotions. Emma's convent school education shone through in her speech, her knowledge of literature and art igniting a spark of intellectual curiosity in Charles that he had long thought dormant. For Emma, Charles represented more than just a man. He was the embodiment of her dreams, a promise of escape from the suffocating monotony of farm life. In her mind, she painted him as a dashing, ambitious doctor, his future as bright and limitless as the horizons she longed to explore. Each word he spoke, each gesture he made, was filtered through the lens of her romantic imagination, transforming the simple country doctor into a hero worthy of her beloved novels. Their courtship unfolded like the pages of a romance, filled with stolen glances and whispered promises. The air around them seemed to crackle with possibility, each moment charged with the electricity of newfound love. When Charles finally gathered the courage to propose, Emma's acceptance came swiftly, like a bird taking flight towards freedom. The wedding that followed transformed the Rouault farm into a fairy tale setting. Flowers adorned every surface, their sweet fragrance mingling with the excitement that hung in the air. Emma, resplendent in her white gown, was the picture of a blushing bride, her eyes shining with the promise of the future she had dreamed of for so long. As the newlyweds settled into their life in toasts, Emma threw herself into her role as Madame Bovary with a fervor that bordered on obsession. The modest house became her canvas, and she set about redecorating with an enthusiasm that knew no bounds. Each new curtain, each carefully placed ornament, was a step towards the life of elegance and sophistication she craved. Emma's ambitions for their social status were limitless. Her voice filled with excitement as she encouraged Charles to expand his medical practice, painting vivid pictures of a future where he would be the most sought-after doctor in the region. "Imagine, Charles," she would say, her eyes sparkling with possibility, "the lives you could change, the respect you would command." Eager to please his young wife, Charles found himself donning new, more fashionable attire. He fumbled with unfamiliar cravats and struggled with tighter-fitting coats, all in an effort to match the image Emma had created of him in her mind. As he looked at himself in the mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back at him, a stranger caught between two worlds. In the quiet moments of the evening, as Emma busied herself with plans and dreams, Charles watched her with a mixture of love and bewilderment. He marveled at her energy, her passion for life, even as he struggled to keep up with her ever-growing expectations. The simple country doctor found himself swept up in a whirlwind of change, clinging to the hope that this new life would bring the joy and fulfillment they both sought. As the days passed, however, a subtle shift began to occur. The initial glow of their marriage began to dim, like a candle slowly burning down. Emma's smile, once radiant and constant, appeared less frequently, replaced by a thoughtful, almost wistful expression. Charles, caught up in the whirlwind of change, failed to notice the growing shadow in his wife's eyes, the way her gaze lingered on the horizon as if searching for something just out of reach. Little did he know that the life he thought they were building together was already beginning to crumble at its foundation. Emma's initial excitement about married life quickly faded into disappointment. The realities of living in Toasties began to set in, casting a shadow over her once bright expectations. As autumn leaves fell and winter's chill crept in, Emma found herself trapped in a life that felt increasingly suffocating. The small town of Toasties, with its narrow cobblestone streets and familiar faces, seemed to close in around her like the walls of a prison. She'd stand at the window for hours, her breath fogging the glass, eyes fixed on the distant horizon, where she imagined a world of excitement and passion waiting just beyond her reach. Charles, her husband, once the object of her romantic fantasies, now appeared to her as dull as the gray sky outside. His contentment with his mediocre medical practice grated on her nerves like nails on a chalkboard. At dinner, she'd watch him eat, her stomach churning at his poor table manners. The sound of his slurping soup echoed in her ears, each noise a reminder of the mundane life she now led. "How was your day, my dear?" Charles would ask, bits of food clinging to his mustache. Emma would force a tight-lipped smile, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fine, Charles. Just fine." Their conversations were as bland as unseasoned porridge, leaving a taste of disappointment in Emma's mouth. While Charles prattled on about his patients or the weather, Emma's mind wandered to far-off places and exciting adventures. She'd nod and hum at appropriate intervals, all the while feeling as though she were slowly drowning in a sea of tedium. To escape the crushing boredom, Emma turned to romantic novels. She devoured them like a starving woman, losing herself in tales of passion and adventure. The pages rustled beneath her fingertips, each turn transporting her further from her reality. With every story, the gap between her fantasies and her life grew wider, a chasm filled with unfulfilled desires. In her mind, Emma walked the bustling streets of Paris, the click of her heels on the pavement, a stark contrast to the soft shuffle of her slippers on the worn carpet of her home. She imagined herself arm in arm with a dashing gentleman, his cologne a heady mix of spice and mystery. At night, she dreamed of attending glamorous balls, her gown shimmering under crystal chandeliers, the music swelling around her as she twirled in the arms of a passionate lover. Desperate to bring a touch of glamour to her mundane existence, Emma began making extravagant purchases. She ordered silk dresses, ornate vases, and delicate china from catalogs, each item a stark contrast to the modest furnishings of their home. When the packages arrived, she'd unwrap them with trembling hands, her heart racing at the sight of each beautiful object. The silk would slip through her fingers like water, the porcelain cool against her skin. But the thrill was always short-lived, leaving her feeling emptier than before, the new possessions mere props in her unfulfilling life. In an attempt to better herself, Emma took up piano lessons and tried to expand her education. She attacked these pursuits with fervor, convinced they would be the key to transforming her life. The piano keys felt cool beneath her fingers as she practiced scales, imagining herself as a renowned musician, playing for adoring crowds. But as the days passed and she found herself still trapped in the same routines, her enthusiasm waned. The piano gathered dust, its silence a testament to her abandoned dreams. As her restlessness grew, Emma's health began to suffer. She experienced bouts of unexplained illness, her body rebelling against the life she was living. Headaches plagued her, pounding behind her eyes like a relentless drumbeat. She often found herself bedridden, too weak to face another day of monotony. The soft sheets felt like sandpaper against her skin, every sensation a reminder of her discontent. Charles, ever the devoted husband, fretted over her, his concern only serving to irritate Emma further. He would sit by her bedside, holding her hand and speaking in soft, soothing tones. But his words fell on deaf ears as Emma retreated further into her inner world, a place where excitement and passion reigned supreme, and the dull ache of reality couldn't touch her. As winter gave way to spring, Emma's despair deepened. She felt like a flower struggling to bloom in barren soil, her potential withering away in the confines of her marriage and small-town life. Just as she thought she could bear it no longer, a glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon. A letter arrived, its seal bearing an unfamiliar crest. Emma's heart raced as she broke the wax, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the paper. Could this be the escape she had been dreaming of? Charles and Emma Bovary received an unexpected invitation. It was for a grand ball at La Vaubyessard, the estate of the Marquis d'Andervilliers, a patient of Charles. Emma's heart fluttered like a caged bird as she read the elegant script, her fingers trembling with a mix of excitement and anxiety. This was her chance, her golden ticket to the world she had only dreamed of in the pages of her beloved novels. In the days leading up to the ball, Emma threw herself into preparations with a fervor that bordered on obsession. The small provincial town of Yonville seemed to shrink around her as she pored over fashion plates, agonizing over every detail of her ensemble. The rustling of paper and the scratch of her pen filled the quiet house as she sketched design after design. Finally, she settled on a gown of pale blue silk, its bodice adorned with delicate lace. As she stood before the mirror, pinning her hair just so, Emma barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She looked different, refined, like she belonged in a different world. The weight of her usual life seemed to lift from her shoulders, replaced by the gossamer light promise of something new. The night of the ball arrived, crisp and clear. As their carriage rolled up the long, winding drive to La Vaubyessard, Emma's breath caught in her throat. The chateau loomed before them, a glittering jewel against the inky sky. Warm light spilled from every window, and the sound of laughter and music drifted on the evening air like a siren's call. Stepping into the grand ballroom was like entering another realm. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft, golden glow over the assembled guests, their light fracturing into 1,000 tiny rainbows. Ladies in rustling silk gowns twirled across the polished floor, their jewels winking in the candlelight like earthbound stars. The air was thick with the scent of perfume, flowers, and the tang of excitement. Emma's heart raced as she took it all in, her senses overwhelmed. She felt as though she had stumbled into one of her beloved novels. The pages come to life around her. With trembling hands, she accepted a flute of champagne from a passing waiter. The bubbles tickled her nose as she took a tentative sip. It was like tasting starlight, she thought, giddy with the novelty of it all. She watched the other guests, drinking in their easy grace, the way they moved and spoke with such assurance. Emma found herself mimicking their mannerisms, desperate to blend in, to be one of them. Each laugh, each gesture was a step further into this glittering new world. As the night wore on, Emma's head spun with the whirlwind of new experiences. She sampled exotic delicacies from far-off lands, each morsel a burst of flavor on her tongue. She listened enraptured to conversations about art and literature, politics and travel. It was as though the whole world had opened up before her, vast and thrilling and full of possibility. And then came the moment that would haunt Emma's dreams for years to come. A handsome viscount approached, extending his hand with a gallant bow. "May I have this dance, madame?" he asked, his voice as smooth as velvet. Emma's heart thundered in her chest as she placed her hand in his. As they whirled across the dance floor, she felt as light as air, transported by the music and the warmth of his touch. The room blurred around her, faces and lights melding into a kaleidoscope of color and movement. All too soon, the night began to fade. As the first pale fingers of dawn crept across the sky, Emma found herself in the carriage once more, heading home to Yonville. The magic of the ball clung to her like perfume, but already she could feel it slipping away. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the countryside roll by in a blur of green and gold. The stark contrast between the world she was leaving and the one she was returning to felt like a physical ache in her chest. In the days and weeks that followed, Emma found herself unable to shake the memories of that enchanted night. The dull routine of her daily life seemed even more stifling in comparison to the glittering world she had glimpsed. She would catch herself daydreaming, lost in recollections of champagne and candlelight, of music and laughter. The monotony of her days stretched before her like an endless, gray road. Late at night, when the house was quiet and still, Emma would creep to her dresser and withdraw a small, silk-wrapped bundle. Carefully, reverently, she would unfold the scrap of fabric, a piece of trim from her ball gown, snipped off in a moment of desperate nostalgia. As she ran her fingers over the smooth silk, Emma could almost hear the strains of the orchestra, could almost feel the warmth of the Viscount's hand on her waist. In those moments, suspended between memory and desire, Emma Bovary tasted the bittersweet flavor of dreams just out of reach. But as the weeks passed, Emma began to notice subtle changes in her body, a persistent fatigue, a strange queasiness in the mornings. At first, she dismissed these symptoms as lingering effects of her melancholy, but as they persisted, a new possibility began to take root in her mind. Could it be? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. As she lay in bed one night, her hand resting lightly on her stomach, Emma wondered if this unexpected development might be the key to rekindling the excitement she had felt at the ball. Little did she know, her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. Emma's life was about to take an unexpected turn. She discovered, with a mixture of trepidation and hope, that she was with child. The news settled over her like a heavy blanket, both comforting and suffocating. As spring blossomed outside her window, Emma's body began to change, her belly swelling like a ripening fruit. She would stand before the mirror, running her hands over the curve of her stomach, imagining the life growing within. In these quiet moments, a flicker of hope ignited in her chest. Perhaps this finally would be the key to the fulfillment she so desperately craved. Months passed, marked by the changing seasons and the steady growth of her child. Emma found herself lost in daydreams, picturing tender moments with a cherubic infant. In her mind's eye, she saw tiny fingers wrapped around her own, wide eyes gazing up at her with pure adoration. These fantasies painted her as the picture of maternal bliss, a role she hoped would give her life the purpose it had always lacked. The day of reckoning arrived with the first chill of autumn. Emma's labor was long and arduous, the pain searing through her body like white-hot lightning. When it was over, the midwife placed a squalling, red-faced girl in her arms. Emma looked down at her daughter, waiting for the rush of love and joy she had anticipated for so long. But as she gazed at the infant's scrunched face, she felt nothing. No spark of connection, no overwhelming maternal instinct, just a hollow emptiness where she had expected her heart to overflow. They named her Bertha, a name that felt foreign on Emma's tongue. Days turned to weeks, and Emma's disappointment festered like an open wound. She had hoped for a son, a little boy who could grow to be strong and adventurous, living the life of excitement and passion she had always craved for herself. Instead, she had a daughter, destined, Emma believed, for the same suffocating domesticity that trapped her. Berta's cries pierced the air like shards of glass, grating on Emma's nerves. She found herself retreating from the nursery, leaving the baby's care to a wet nurse. The soft coos and gurgles that should have melted her heart only served to remind Emma of her failure to feel what a mother should. As Berthe grew, toddling on unsteady legs and reaching out with chubby hands, Emma's indifference calcified into something harder, colder. When the child sought her mother's embrace, Emma would push her away, her touch as frigid as a winter's morning. Each rejection was a small cruelty, a reflection of Emma's own unfulfilled desires projected onto her innocent daughter. Charles, oblivious to his wife's inner turmoil, showered Berthe with affection. He would scoop the girl up in his arms, peppering her face with kisses and delighting in her giggles. The sight of their easy bond was like vinegar in Emma's wounds, intensifying her resentment. Why could she not feel what came so naturally to her husband? The weight of motherhood pressed down on Emma like a lead blanket, suffocating her dreams and ambitions. She began to see Charles and Berthe not as her family, but as shackles binding her to a life she never wanted. The walls of their home seemed to close in around her, a prison of her own making. The once cheerful yellow wallpaper now appeared sickly and oppressive, mocking her with its forced brightness. Depression settled over Emma like a thick fog, obscuring any joy or purpose she might have found in her daily life. She retreated to her bed, burrowing under the covers as if she could hide from the responsibilities that awaited her. Hours slipped by as she lay there, her mind a carousel of regret and longing for a life she couldn't have. The ticking of the clock on the mantel became a torturous reminder of time passing, of opportunities slipping away. Charles watched his wife's descent with growing concern, his brow furrowed with worry. He longed to reach out to her, to bridge the chasm that had opened between them, but Emma had become as unreachable as a star in the night sky. In his desperation to help her, Charles grasped at the idea of a fresh start. Perhaps a change of scenery would lift Emma's spirits and breathe new life into their family. And so, with hope in his heart and worry etched on his face, Charles made the decision to move their little family to the larger town of Yonville. As they packed up their belongings, Emma felt a small stirring of anticipation. Could this be the change she needed? As their carriage rolled towards their new home, Emma's heart quickened with an unfamiliar feeling, possibility. Little did she know that waiting for her in Yonville was a young law clerk named Léon Dupuis, whose arrival would set in motion a series of events that would alter her world forever. Emma's life in Yonville was about to change dramatically. The arrival of Léon Dupuis, a young law clerk, would set in motion a series of events that would alter her world forever. The air was thick with the scent of blooming roses when Emma first laid eyes on Léon. He stood out in the crowd at the town gathering, his intelligent eyes scanning the room with curiosity. Emma felt a jolt of electricity course through her body as their gazes met. In that moment, the dull hum of conversation faded away, leaving only the thunderous beating of her heart. Their first encounters were like a delicate dance, each step carefully measured. Emma found herself drawn to Léon's presence, her breath catching in her throat whenever he entered a room. She'd watch him from the corner of her eye, admiring the way his hands moved expressively as he spoke about literature or art. His passion ignited something within her, a spark of life she thought had long been extinguished. As summer days stretched into languid evenings, Emma and Léon gravitated towards each other. Their conversations flowed like honey, sweet and rich with shared interests. They'd lose track of time discussing poetry, their words painting vivid pictures of far-off lands and grand adventures. In these moments, Emma felt truly alive, her spirit soaring beyond the confines of Yonville's narrow streets. Léon became the embodiment of Emma's romantic ideals. His youthful enthusiasm and cultured mind were a stark contrast to Charles's simple nature. She began to imagine Léon as the hero of her own personal novel, a dashing figure who could sweep her off her feet and into a world of passion and excitement. The mere thought of him sent shivers down her spine. For Léon, Emma was equally enchanting. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was her sophistication and depth that truly captivated him. He found himself looking forward to their encounters with an eagerness that both thrilled and frightened him. His heart would race at the sight of her, his palms growing damp with nervous anticipation. Their relationship, though never crossing the line into physical intimacy, grew deep and emotionally charged. Emma began to neglect her household duties, her thoughts constantly drifting to Léon. The once tedious task of going to the market became an adventure, as she hoped to catch a glimpse of him or exchange a few words. Her world seemed to come alive with color whenever he was near. Charles, oblivious to the change in his wife, continued his daily routines. Emma's indifference towards him grew, like a shadow slowly engulfing their marriage. She found herself comparing every aspect of Charles to Léon, and her husband always fell short. The contrast between the two men was as stark as night and day. The forbidden nature of their attraction only added to its allure. Emma reveled in the secret glances and hidden meanings in their conversations. It was as if she and Léon shared a private world, one that existed parallel to the humdrum reality of Yonville. Every stolen moment felt like a precious gem, to be treasured and remembered. But as their emotional intimacy deepened, so did Léon's guilt. He was acutely aware of the impossibility of their situation. The weight of his feelings for a married woman began to press down on him, like a heavy cloak he couldn't shrug off. His nights were filled with restless dreams, torn between desire and duty. One crisp autumn morning, Léon made a decision that would shatter Emma's world. He announced his intention to leave for Paris to continue his studies. The news hit Emma like a physical blow, leaving her gasping for air. The world seemed to spin around her, and she had to grip the edge of a table to steady herself. As Léon's departure day approached, Emma felt as if the colors were draining from her world. The thought of Yonville without him seemed unbearable, a return to the gray monotony she had known before. She wandered through her days in a daze, her heart aching with each passing hour. The day Léon left was etched in Emma's memory like a scar. She watched from her window as his carriage disappeared down the road, taking with it her dreams of romance and adventure. The finality of his departure left her feeling more trapped than ever in her unfulfilling life. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of her muffled sobs. In the wake of Léon's absence, Emma's restlessness grew like a wildfire. The taste of excitement and passion she had experienced only served to highlight the emptiness of her current existence. As she stood at her window, staring at the road that had taken Léon away, Emma felt a reckless determination building within her. This emotional affair, now ended, had awakened something in her, a hunger for more that would not be easily satisfied. Just as Emma thought her world had lost all its luster, fate intervened. On a sweltering summer afternoon, a commotion outside caught her attention. A carriage had pulled up to Charles's medical practice, and from it emerged a figure that would once again set Emma's heart racing. Who was this mysterious newcomer, and what impact would he have on her already tumultuous life? Rodolphe Boulanger, a wealthy and charismatic landowner, entered Emma's life unexpectedly one summer afternoon. He arrived at Charles's medical practice, accompanying a servant who required treatment for a minor injury. The moment Rodolphe stepped into the room, the air seemed to crackle with electricity. His eyes, a deep shade of brown, swept across the modest office before settling on Emma. She stood by the window, bathed in soft sunlight that highlighted the delicate curves of her face. Time seemed to slow as their gazes locked, a silent exchange that spoke volumes. Emma felt her breath catch in her throat. Rodolphe's presence filled the room, his confident stance and well-tailored clothes a stark contrast to the drab surroundings. She found herself straightening her dress, suddenly aware of every imperfection in her appearance. As Charles tended to the servant, Rodolphe and Emma engaged in polite conversation. His voice was rich and smooth, each word carefully chosen to intrigue and captivate. Emma found herself hanging on every syllable, her mind racing with possibilities she had long since buried. In the weeks that followed, Rodolphe's visits became more frequent. Each encounter left Emma feeling more alive, more vibrant than she had in years. The monotony of her daily life began to fade, replaced by a thrilling sense of anticipation. Rodolphe, for his part, recognized the yearning in Emma's eyes. He saw the trapped butterfly, desperate to spread its wings and fly. With the skill of a master seducer, he began to weave a tapestry of romance and adventure. Their clandestine meetings in the woods became Emma's lifeline. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the whisper of wind through the trees, the dappled sunlight on their skin. Every sensation was heightened, every moment precious. Emma's heart raced with each stolen kiss, each passionate embrace. As summer turned to autumn, Emma's world narrowed to the space between Rodolphe's arms. She neglected her duties, her thoughts constantly drifting to their next rendezvous. The scent of his cologne lingered on her skin, a secret reminder of their forbidden love. But while Emma's passion burned bright and true, a seed of doubt began to take root in her heart. In quiet moments when the euphoria of their encounters faded, she caught glimpses of something cold in Rodolphe's eyes. A calculation that sent a chill down her spine. Still, Emma pushed these thoughts aside, convincing herself that their love was destined for greatness. She borrowed money recklessly, buying lavish gifts for Rodolphe that she could ill afford. Each extravagance was a testament to her devotion, a physical manifestation of the depth of her feelings. As the leaves began to turn, Emma's actions grew increasingly desperate. The idea of escape took hold, a fever dream of freedom from the suffocating confines of her marriage. She made hurried arrangements for Bertha's care, her maternal instincts momentarily overridden by the promise of a new life. With trembling hands, Emma penned a letter to Rodolphe, pouring out her heart and detailing her plans for their elopement. She sealed it with a kiss, her lips leaving a faint imprint on the envelope. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town of Yonville, Emma made her way to Rodolphe's estate. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of excitement and terror coursing through her veins. This was it, the moment that would change everything. She approached the grand house, the letter clutched tightly to her chest. But as she neared the entrance, a chill wind swept through the garden, rustling the leaves and sending a shiver down her spine. Something in the air felt different, ominous. Emma hesitated at the door, her hand poised to knock. In that moment of stillness, she heard the faint sound of pen scratching against paper, drifting from an open window above. Rodolphe's voice, usually so warm and inviting, now sounded cold and distant as he muttered to himself. "My dear Emma," he began, his tone laced with an emotion Emma couldn't quite place. "I'm afraid I must." The words trailed off, lost in the growing darkness. Emma stood frozen, her world teetering on the edge of a precipice, unaware of the heartbreak that awaited her on the other side of that door. The crisp autumn air carried a melancholy chill, mirroring the heaviness in Rodolphe's heart. Leaves rustled beneath his feet as he made his way to his writing desk, each step echoing the finality of his decision. The scratching of his quill against parchment filled the room, a harsh sound in the oppressive silence. Rodolphe's hand trembled as he penned his farewell. Each word felt like a dagger, not just to Emma's dreams, but to a part of himself he was leaving behind. The candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows across the paper, as if trying to obscure the cruel truth of his words. With a deep sigh, he folded the letter and sealed it with wax, the soft hiss of melting wax punctuating the end of their grand romance. Across town, Emma's heart fluttered with anticipation. Her fingers, usually so delicate, tore at the envelope with uncharacteristic urgency. As her eyes devoured the words, the world around her seemed to blur and tilt. The letter slipped from her grasp, floating to the floor like a fallen leaf. She collapsed, her legs giving way beneath her, a marionette with cut strings. Emma's sobs racked her body, seeming to emanate from the very core of her being. The betrayal hit her like a tidal wave, sweeping away her hopes and leaving her adrift in a sea of despair. The room spun around her, the familiar objects of her daily life now alien and mocking in their mundanity. For weeks, Emma languished in a feverish haze. Her illness was a physical manifestation of her broken heart, her body burning with the same intensity as her shattered dreams. She retreated into the depths of her mind, teetering on the precipice between life and death. In her delirium, Emma's mind conjured vivid hallucinations. She wandered through landscapes of her own creation, where reality and fantasy blurred like watercolors on wet canvas. Lush gardens gave way to barren deserts, and stormy seas crashed against snow-capped mountains. At times, she stood at the threshold of death, peering into the great unknown, only to be pulled back by an unseen force. Charles, oblivious to the true nature of Emma's affliction, became her unwavering sentinel. The circles under his eyes deepened with each passing day as he sat by her bedside, his medical knowledge rendered useless against the storm raging within his wife. Their savings dwindled as he sought every possible remedy, his love for Emma as blind as it was devoted. As winter's icy grip loosened and the first hints of spring emerged, Emma's fever broke. She awoke to a world that seemed both familiar and strange, as if seeing it through new eyes. The sunlight streaming through the window felt harsh on her skin, and the chirping of birds outside sounded almost discordant after the silence of her illness. In those initial days of recovery, a change came over Emma. She turned her attention to Charles and Berthe with a newfound tenderness, like a flower unfurling its petals after a long frost. Her hands, once restless and searching for excitement, now found purpose in the simple act of stroking her daughter's hair or holding her husband's hand. The Bovary family, seeking a fresh start, decided to uproot their lives and move to Yonville. The larger town promised new opportunities for Charles's practice and a chance for Emma to reinvent herself. As they packed their belongings, Emma felt a glimmer of hope, fragile as a soap bubble, but present nonetheless. The act of wrapping each item, deciding what to keep and what to leave behind, felt symbolic of shedding her old self. In Yonville, Emma threw herself into domestic life with surprising vigor. She managed the household with efficiency, her hands busy with tasks she had once disdained. The rhythmic chopping of vegetables, the soft swish of a broom across the floor, the gentle bubbling of a pot on the stove, these sounds became a soothing symphony, drowning out the echoes of her past desires. She lavished attention on Berthe, braiding her daughter's hair and reading her stories with animated voices. The weight of Berthe in her lap, the smell of her clean hair, the sound of her giggles, these sensations grounded Emma in the present, offering a different kind of fulfillment than she had ever known. For a time, it seemed as though Emma had found contentment in the simple rhythms of family life. The days passed in a peaceful blur, each one much like the last. But as her strength returned, so too did the restlessness that had always simmered beneath her placid exterior. Like a dormant seed awakening with the spring thaw, her old dissatisfaction began to sprout anew. She found herself staring out windows, her gaze fixed on distant horizons, her mind wandering to places beyond the confines of Yonville. The walls of their home, once a comforting embrace, now felt like they were closing in on her. The memory of her passionate affair with Rodolphe lingered like a bittersweet perfume. In quiet moments, Emma would close her eyes and relive their stolen embraces, the ghost of his touch sending shivers down her spine. The romantic disillusionment she had suffered left an indelible mark on her soul, a wound that had scabbed over but never truly healed. As summer approached, bringing with it long, languid days, Emma's facade of contentment began to crack. The domestic tranquility she had cultivated now felt suffocating, a gilded cage that could no longer contain her yearning spirit. She found herself once again dreaming of passion, adventure, and a life beyond the mundane existence that stretched before her. The air grew thick with unspoken desires and suppressed longings. Emma's hands, once steady in their domestic tasks, now trembled with barely contained energy. Her eyes, which had found joy in the simple pleasures of home, now darted restlessly, searching for something, anything, to reignite the spark within her. As the sun set on another unremarkable day in Yonville, Emma stood at her bedroom window, her fingers tracing patterns on the glass. The fading light cast long shadows across the room, and in that moment, she felt more alone than ever. A sudden, overwhelming urge to run, to escape, to feel alive again, coursed through her veins. Her heart raced, her breath quickened, and she knew with startling clarity that something had to change. But what? And at what cost? Emma's recent illness had left her feeling fragile and exposed. In the aftermath of her recovery, she found herself desperately searching for meaning in her life. The world around her seemed muted, as if viewed through a veil of gauze. Even the familiar streets of Yonville felt alien, the faces of her neighbors blurring into indistinct shapes as she passed. In this vulnerable state, Emma turned to religion, hoping to find solace in its ancient rituals and promises of salvation. The church became her refuge, its cool stone walls offering a comforting embrace. The scent of incense hung heavy in the air, mingling with the earthy smell of old wood and the faint metallic tang of candle smoke. Emma would sit for hours in the dim light, her fingers tracing the worn edges of her prayer book, seeking answers in its well-thumbed pages. With a fervor that surprised even herself, Emma threw herself into charitable works. Her once soft hands grew calloused from mending clothes for the poor, the rough fabric a stark contrast to the silks and satins she had once dreamed of. The local priest, his kind face etched with lines of compassion, became her confidant and guide. His gentle words and understanding nods provided a balm for her restless soul. For a time, this newfound piety seemed to fill the void that had long plagued Emma's heart. The rituals of faith provided structure to her days, a purpose to her existence. She found comfort in the rhythmic chanting of prayers, the familiar cadence washing over her like waves on a shore. Yet as the weeks passed, a familiar discontent began to creep back into her heart. It was a subtle thing at first, a whisper of dissatisfaction that grew louder with each passing day. It was during this waning of her religious enthusiasm that Charles suggested a trip to Rouen to see an opera. The words were barely out of his mouth before Emma's heart leapt with excitement. Her mind raced with visions of glittering chandeliers and velvet curtains, of a world far removed from the mundane reality of Yonville. The journey to the city passed in a blur of anticipation. Emma pressed her face to the carriage window, watching as the countryside rushed by in a patchwork of greens and golds. The familiar fields and farmhouses gave way to the bustling streets of Rouen, each turn of the wheels bringing her closer to the promise of excitement. As they approached the opera house, Emma's breath caught in her throat. The building stood before them, grand and imposing, its facade a testament to the wonders that lay within. The marble steps gleamed in the evening light, and Emma felt a thrill of excitement course through her veins as she ascended them, her arm linked with Charles. But it was not the opera that would leave an indelible mark on her memory that night. There in the crowded foyer stood Léon. Time seemed to slow as their eyes met across the sea of silk and satin. The chatter of the crowd faded to a distant hum, and Emma felt her heart begin to race. Léon had changed. Gone was the shy, awkward young man she had known. In his place stood a confident, worldly gentleman, his time in Paris having sculpted him into something new and enticing. His eyes held a spark of recognition and something more, a heat that made Emma's cheeks flush. Their reunion was electric, each word laden with unspoken meaning. As they exchanged pleasantries, Emma was acutely aware of the warmth of Léon's hand as it brushed against hers, the subtle cologne that clung to his skin. The opera faded into the background, a mere backdrop to the connection that now crackled between them. In the days that followed, Emma found herself consumed by thoughts of Léon. The memory of their encounter burned bright in her mind, overshadowing the dull routine of her life in Yonville. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing the vibrant world that lay just beyond her reach. The colors seemed brighter, the air sweeter, every sensation heightened by the promise of what could be. With a recklessness born of desperation, Emma began to orchestrate regular trips to Rouen. To Charles and the world, she was diligently attending piano lessons, determined to cultivate her musical talents. But in truth, each journey was a clandestine rendezvous with Léon, their passion growing bolder with each stolen moment. Their affair was a whirlwind of stolen kisses and fervent embraces, hidden away in shadowy corners and discreet hotel rooms. The thrill of secrecy added an intoxicating edge to their encounters. Emma reveled in the danger, her heart pounding with each near discovery, each hurried goodbye. She became adept at weaving elaborate tales to explain her absences, her lies flowing as easily as water over smooth stones. The double life she now led was exhilarating, a stark contrast to the stifling monotony of her marriage. In Léon's arms, Emma felt truly alive, as if she were finally the heroine in her own romantic novel. Yet, as the weeks turned to months, a familiar restlessness began to creep into Emma's heart. The passionate embraces that had once set her soul aflame now felt routine. The stolen moments together no longer enough to satisfy her insatiable appetite for excitement. She found herself constantly pushing for more, More passion, more risk, more of the intoxicating rush that came with defying society's expectations. As the novelty of the affair began to wear thin, Emma's dissatisfaction grew like a shadow at dusk, slowly but inexorably engulfing the bright flame of her passion. She looked to Leon with increasingly desperate eyes, silently pleading for him to rekindle the spark that had once burned so brightly between them. But try as she might, Emma found herself once again standing on the precipice of discontent, her heart yearning for an elusive happiness that seemed forever just out of reach. As Emma returned from her latest rendezvous with Leon, a strange restlessness settled over her. The thrill of their affair had begun to fade, leaving behind a hollow ache. She stood before her mirror, studying her reflection with critical eyes. Was this all there was? A life of stolen moments and secret passions? As she turned away, her gaze fell upon an ornate invitation that had arrived that morning. The gilded edges seemed to shimmer with promise, hinting at a world of luxury and excitement beyond anything she had yet experienced. Emma's fingers trembled as she reached for the envelope, her heart racing with anticipation. Little did she know, the simple piece of paper would be the key to unlocking a new chapter in her life, one that would sweep her off her feet and into a dizzying world of silk and champagne. Emma's world had become a dizzying carousel of silk and champagne. Each spin took her further from the life she once knew, propelling her into a realm of luxury and deceit. At the center of this whirlwind stood Leroux, a merchant with a fox's smile and a shark's appetite. His shop, a treasure trove of temptations, beckoned Emma with its glittering wares. Lace collars whispered promises of elegance, velvet cloaks offered the warmth of sophistication, and crystal perfume bottles winked seductively in the soft lamplight. Leroux circled Emma like a predator, his eyes gleaming as he offered her credit after credit. The scratch of his pen on paper was like nails on a chalkboard, each signature binding Emma tighter in a web of debt. Yet she couldn't resist. With trembling hands, she signed another promissory note, the merchant's pen a poisoned chalice she eagerly drank from. Rouen became Emma's playground, a stage for her reinvention. The cobblestone streets echoed with the click of her heels as she swept through the city like a duchess. Leon on her arm and a new hat perched atop her carefully coiffed hair. The air was thick with the scent of fresh bread and possibility, intoxicating Emma with dreams of a grander life. They dined in restaurants with names that rolled off the tongue like poetry, sipping wine that sparkled like liquid starlight. The candlelight danced across Emma's face, casting shadows that hid the worry lines beginning to form at the corners of her eyes. In those moments, bathed in adoration and the soft glow of chandeliers, Emma felt truly alive. But the magic always faded as she returned home, reality settling over her like a heavy fog. The familiar creaks of the floorboards and Charles's gentle snores from the next room were constant reminders of the lie she lived. With shaking fingers, she forged his signature on yet another loan document, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would wake him. The guilt was a stone in her stomach, growing heavier with each deception. As winter gave way to spring, Emma's web of lies grew more tangled. She pawned her mother-in-law's jewelry, the gold glinting accusingly as it disappeared into a velvet-lined box. The pawnbroker's eyes, cold and calculating, seemed to see right through her facade. She borrowed money from acquaintances, spinning tales of temporary hardship that left a bitter taste in her mouth. Each new debt was a step deeper into quicksand, and Emma could feel herself sinking, the grains of her former life slipping away. Leroux watched her struggle with the cold eyes of a banker tallying his profits. He could smell the desperation on her like cheap perfume, cloying and unmistakable. Still, he extended his hand, offering one more loan, one more chance at the life she craved. Emma grasped it like a drowning woman clutching at driftwood, her nails digging into his palm. The numbers blurred before her eyes as she tried to make sense of her accounts. Bills piled up like autumn leaves, each one a whisper of impending doom. Emma's attempts to juggle her finances became increasingly frantic, a high-wire act without a safety net. She sold family heirlooms in secret, each piece carrying away a fragment of her soul, leaving her feeling hollow and adrift. As summer blazed outside, Emma's world grew colder. The walls of her home seemed to close in, the air thick with unspoken accusations. She moved through her days like a ghost, haunted by the specter of discovery. Her laughter with Leon took on a brittle edge, their stolen moments tainted by the price she knew she'd have to pay. The weight of her secrets pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. In quiet moments, Emma stared at her reflection, searching for the woman she'd once been. But the mirror showed only a stranger, eyes hollow with fear and lips stained with lies. She had become a prisoner of her own making, the key to her cell buried beneath a mountain of unpaid debts. The once vibrant dreams that had fueled her escapades now felt like ashes in her mouth. As autumn approached, bringing with it a chill wind of change, Emma's spending habits spiraled further out of control. She lost track of the full extent of her financial troubles, her attempts to manage her debts becoming increasingly desperate and ill-conceived. With each passing day, she sank deeper into financial and moral bankruptcy, the weight of her choices dragging her inexorably toward a reckoning she could no longer avoid. The crisp autumn air carried whispers of impending doom. Emma's hands shook as she opened yet another envelope, the contents blurring before her tear-filled eyes. The numbers danced mockingly, a sum so large it made her head spin. As the reality of her situation crashed over her like a tidal wave, Emma felt the ground beneath her feet begin to crumble. She stood at the edge of a precipice, teetering on the brink of a fall that threatened to shatter everything she held dear. Emma Bovary stood on the precipice of financial ruin, her heart pounding with fear. The specter of impending public disgrace loomed over her, threatening to shatter the carefully crafted facade of her life. The morning sun cast long shadows across Yonville's cobblestone streets as Emma set out on her desperate quest for salvation. The air was thick with the scent of freshly baked bread and the distant lowing of cattle, a cruel reminder of the simple life she had always scorned. With each step, the weight of her debts seemed to press down upon her shoulders, making her stumble on the uneven ground. Her first stop was the grand estate of Rodolphe, her former lover. The gravel crunched beneath her feet as she approached the imposing doors, each step feeling like a mile. Emma's hands trembled as she raised the brass knocker, the sound echoing through the quiet morning air. "Please, Rodolphe," she begged, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need your help. I'm drowning in debt." But Rodolphe's eyes, once filled with passion, now held only cold indifference. The warmth she had once basked in was gone, replaced by a chill that seemed to freeze her very soul. He turned her away without a second glance, leaving Emma feeling smaller and more alone than ever before. Undeterred by this first rejection, Emma pressed on, her desperation growing with each passing hour. The streets of Yonville, once her playground of romantic fantasies, now seemed to close in around her. Every face she passed held the potential for judgment, every whispered conversation a possible discussion of her shame. She approached other men from her past, her pride crumbling with every rejection. The taste of bile rose in her throat as she offered herself, her dignity, her very being, in exchange for financial assistance. But doors slammed in her face, one after another, each rejection a hammer blow to her fragile psyche. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town square, Emma found herself at the door of Monsieur Guillaumin, the notary, her last hope. The scent of musty papers and ink filled her nostrils as she stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. "Monsieur Guillaumin," Emma said, her voice quivering, "I have a proposition for you." The notary's eyes widened as Emma made her offer, hope flickering in her chest like a candle in the wind. But it was quickly extinguished as Guillaumin, too, turned her away, his rejection tinged with a mix of pity and disgust that cut Emma to her very core. She stumbled out into the street, her world spinning. The realization of her situation hit her like a physical blow, leaving her gasping for air. The once familiar buildings of Yonville now loomed over her like accusing fingers, pointing out her failures for all to see. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, a dark thought took root in Emma's mind. With heavy steps, she made her way to the pharmacy of Monsieur Homais. The little bell above the door tinkled cheerfully, a stark contrast to the storm raging within her. "Rats," Emma muttered, her eyes darting around the shop. "I need something to kill the rats." Homais, oblivious to her true intentions, happily provided her with a large quantity of arsenic. The weight of the poison in her hands felt like a sentence, final and irreversible. As she left the shop, the cool night air seemed a whisper of release, of an end to the torment that had become her life. Back at home, Emma moved as if in a trance. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of the clock, counting down her final moments. With shaking hands, she brought the arsenic to her lips and swallowed. The bitter taste lingered on her tongue, a last reminder of the life she was leaving behind. At first, there was nothing but that bitter taste. Then slowly, the pain began to build. It started in her stomach, a dull ache that quickly grew into a raging inferno. Emma collapsed to the floor, her body racked with agony. The polished wood beneath her cheek felt cool against her feverish skin, a small comfort in her final moments. "Charles!" she cried out, her voice barely recognizable. Her husband rushed to her side, his face a mask of confusion and fear. As understanding dawned in his eyes, Charles let out a cry of anguish that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The sound of his grief echoed through the empty rooms, a haunting melody of love and loss. "Why, Emma?" he sobbed, cradling her in his arms. "Why?" Through the haze of pain, Emma looked up at her husband. In his eyes, she saw all the love and devotion she had taken for granted. A wave of regret washed over her, mingling with a fierce defiance. She had made her choice, for better or worse. As the poison worked its way through her system, Emma's mind drifted. She thought of her life, of the dreams and desires that had led her to this moment. The faces of her lovers flashed before her eyes, followed by the disappointed gaze of her father, the innocent smile of her daughter. Each memory was a bittersweet reminder of the life she was leaving behind. The pain intensified, each breath a struggle. Emma's vision began to blur, the room around her fading into darkness. In her final moments, a strange sense of peace settled over her. The weight of her debts, her shame, her unfulfilled desires, all of it seemed to lift away, leaving her feeling lighter than she had in years. With one last, shuddering breath, Emma Bovary closed her eyes. The room fell silent, save for the quiet sobs of Charles and the ever-present ticking of the clock, now marking the end of a life cut tragically short. As Emma's body grew still in his arms, Charles felt the world crumbling around him. The air seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. He looked down at his wife's pale face, unable to comprehend the finality of what had just occurred. In that moment, as the first rays of dawn began to creep through the window, Charles had no idea of the storm that was about to break over his head, or how Emma's final act would shatter his world beyond repair. Emma's suicide shattered Charles's world in an instant. He was left reeling, alone to face the harsh aftermath of her final desperate act. The once bustling household now stood silent, a tomb of memories. Sunlight filtered through dusty curtains, casting long shadows across the floor where Emma's footsteps once echoed. Charles moved through the rooms like a ghost, his fingers trailing over her belongings, each touch a bittersweet reminder of what he'd lost. As the fog of grief began to lift, a more insidious pain took root. Like a surgeon peeling back layers of diseased flesh, Charles uncovered the truth of his marriage. Hidden letters spilled from drawers, their contents burning his eyes and searing his heart. Unpaid bills fluttered to the floor, a paper trail of Emma's secret life. Whispered confessions from neighbors and acquaintances completed the picture, each word another crack in the foundation of his world. The truth was a bitter pill, lodging in his throat and threatening to choke him. Emma, his beloved wife, had led a double life of affairs and financial deceit. Yet even as this harsh reality seeped into his bones, Charles couldn't bring himself to hate her. His love, pure and unwavering, transformed her memory into something sacred. In his mind's eye, Emma became a martyr, a delicate flower crushed by the cruelty of the world. He clung to this idealized version of his wife like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood, his knuckles white with desperation. The weight of grief and shock took its toll on Charles's body. His once steady hands now trembled like autumn leaves in a storm. Dark circles carved themselves under his eyes, which had lost their spark of life. His medical practice, once a source of pride, fell into neglect. Patients' concerns faded into a dull roar as he struggled to make it through each day, barely able to focus on the simplest tasks. Little Berthe, now motherless, looked to her father for comfort and care. Her small hands tugged at his sleeve, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. But Charles, lost in his own pain, could barely tend to himself, let alone a child. He'd stare at Berthe for long moments, seeing Emma's features reflected in her innocent face, before turning away, unable to bear the resemblance. The house, once filled with Emma's laughter and dreams, now echoed with silence and despair. Dust gathered on the piano keys Emma would never touch again. Her dresses hung in the wardrobe like colorful ghosts, their scent fading day by day. One fateful afternoon, as Charles wandered the streets like a man sleepwalking, he encountered Rodolphe. The man who had stolen Emma's heart stood before him, a living reminder of his wife's betrayal. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, sounds muffling as if Charles were underwater. Yet in a moment of misplaced gratitude that spoke volumes of his delusion, Charles thanked Rodolphe. "You made her happy," he said, his voice cracking with emotion, barely above a whisper. "For that, I am grateful." The words tasted like ashes in his mouth, but he meant them with every fiber of his being. The encounter proved too much for Charles's fragile state. Like a candle burning its last wick, his life force flickered and faded. Within days, he too was gone, leaving Berthe truly alone in the world. The little girl stood by his bedside, her small hand clutching his cold fingers, not fully understanding the finality of what had happened. Berthe, a living testament to her parents' tragic story, was shuffled from one relative to another like an unwanted parcel. First, she went to live with her paternal grandmother, a kind but frail woman ill-equipped to raise a young child. The old woman's love was no match for the ravages of time, and soon she too passed away, leaving Berthe adrift once more. Next, Berthe found herself in the care of her aunt, but where Emma had seen a daughter to dote upon, the aunt saw only a burden. The once cherished child became an unwelcome guest, her presence a constant reminder of family tragedy. Meals were served with cold looks, bedtime stories replaced by harsh words and impatient sighs. As weeks turned to months, the aunt's patience wore thin. In a decision born of desperation and callousness, she sent Berthe to work in a cotton mill. The final scene of this tragic tale unfolded in the harsh, unforgiving environment of industrial labor. There, amidst the deafening roar of machinery and choking clouds of cotton dust, stood Berthe. Her small hands, once destined for piano keys and fine silks, now calloused and raw from endless toil. The luxurious life Emma had dreamed of for her daughter had evaporated like morning mist, leaving behind a stark reality that served as a haunting reminder of the far-reaching consequences of her actions. As the factory whistle shrieked, signaling the end of another grueling day, Berthe paused by a grimy window. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of red and gold, a beauty that seemed to mock the harshness of her existence. For a moment, she allowed herself to dream of a different life, one filled with the love and luxury her mother had so desperately craved. But as quickly as it came, the moment passed. Berthe turned away from the window, her small shoulders squared with a resolve beyond her years. She may have been born into a story of passion and tragedy, but her own tale was just beginning, and in the depths of her eyes there flickered a spark of determination that neither her mother's dreams nor her father's devotion could extinguish.
This book was generated using Speakter's AI voices. You can create human-like voiceovers in over 50 languages.